Hello and welcome to this course, ASP.NET Core Cross-Platform Development. I'm your instructor, Trevoir Williams, and I've been a software engineer and lecturer for over a decade. In this course, we're going to be following a few simple steps that can be replicated across any platform. That's right, you're going to do this course whether you're using Mac OS, Linux, or Windows, and you'll be able to follow along and build an ASP.NET Core MVC application. Alright guys, so we're continuing to set up our environment, and the next step is to install the .NET 7 SDK. You can get here simply by going to .net.microsoft.com, or you can just Google .NET 7 SDK, right? I think that's the easiest thing to do. Just Google .NET 7 SDK, and the first search result I'm sure would lead you to this page. Now, .NET 7 is the latest release at the time of recording. However, it is a standard term release, meaning that it will go out of style when .NET 8 comes out. We also have version 6.0, which is long-term support. So a lot of what we'll be doing in this course, even though we'll be using .NET 7, it will be more or less compatible with .NET 6, barring maybe a few C# phrases and so on. But I'll be sure to point out where the code will differ between what .NET 7 offers and what we can do in .NET 6. At the time of this recording, however, .NET 7 is the latest and greatest, and so we will use that, and you can feel free to proceed using .NET 7. So to get started, you'll want to install the SDK. Now, there are two things that you'll want to install. You want to install the SDK for development purposes, and of course, you can choose your operating system accordingly. So if you're on a Windows machine, you'll want to use the 64-bit, and you can choose Mac or Linux versions accordingly. But then for hosting purposes, you would also want to install the runtime. So you can also install the hosting bundle for Windows or the appropriate version based on your operating system. So you can download and install those two. That being said, we'll be using Visual Studio Code because Visual Studio Code is cross-platform, and we want to cater for all the operating systems, Linux, Mac, and Windows. So we'll be using Visual Studio Code. However, if you are on a Windows machine and you prefer to use Visual Studio, which is a fully powered, very, very powerful IDE, then you can just stick to the Windows, and you can actually just download and install Visual Studio 2022, which will come with the SDK built in. So I'm just throwing that out there, right? So if you'll be using Visual Studio Code, which is far more lightweight and compact, and we'll be using a lot of .NET CLI commands, then you can go ahead and install the SDK manually. If you want to use Visual Studio 2022, and I'll be showing you how to set up Visual Studio 2022 in a subsequent lesson, then you can actually skip the SDK download step. However, I do recommend that you get the runtime regardless. So once you download and install those, and it's a simple installation, you just hit next, 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 next until it installs, and then you can close the window. Then you can go on to the next lesson where we will be setting up Visual Studio Code. Alright guys, welcome back. So we've installed our SDK, and the next step is to install Visual Studio Code. Now, Visual Studio Code is a very flexible and lightweight IDE given to us by Microsoft, and on top of all of that, it is free, and it is cross-platform, so we can use it on Mac, on Windows, or on Linux. I'm using a Windows machine, so of course I would proceed to download for Windows, but be sure to choose the one that is most appropriate for you. Now, downloading and installing is very easy. You'll get an MSI package that once you double click it, will launch the installer, and after a few clicks, it will install all the binaries and be on your machine. And just by way of preview, this is what you can expect. You can expect something looking like this. So I've had this installed for a while now, and I've used it on several projects. So you may see that I have some icons that you may not have out of the box. For instance, if this is your first time, you may not have anything under recent, but you can always start, open file, open folder. You can clone a Git repository. to your machine. And then to the side, you have the Explorer window. You can search, you can do some source control stuff, you can run and debug, and then you have Remote Explorer and extensions. And then the other things that I have here are some other plugins that I have from side projects. For this course, those are not absolutely necessary, but I will make sure to point out things that you will need as we go along, and how you can set up your environment and optimize it for the project that we will be working on. So once you have Visual Studio Code installed, then you're good to go. And it has a lot of built-in features that we will explore along the way. However, if you prefer the idea of using Visual Studio, because the Visual Studio Code requires that we use a lot of command line interface commands, and Visual Studio actually does a good job of helping you to just click around and accomplish some of those things. Docker is a very fast application that allows us to use what we call containers instead of a whole virtualized environment. So what we can do is use Docker to simulate the environment needed, and only the environment needed, for a particular application to run without needing the entire operating system. So what we're going to do is use Docker to simulate an environment for SQL Server, and then we would be able to connect to the SQL Server just the same, even if you're not using a Windows machine. Now, the first thing you'd notice is that it is available for every operating system pretty much, right? So if you're using Windows, you can still use Docker. If you have an Apple device or Linux-based device or Intel chip-based device, you can just the same way install Docker. So go ahead, download and install it. I already have it installed on my Windows machine, but once you have installed it, what you will get is access to the Docker command line commands. So once you have it installed, hit pause, let it install, and then you can continue. I would encourage you to launch your terminal. So once again, I'm using a Windows machine, but your terminal on Linux or Mac OS X would look very similar to this. And you can simply run the command Docker just to make sure that it's installed. And if you see something looking like this, then you know you have access to the Docker CLI commands. All right. So what we want to do at this point is run a command that's called Docker pull. Let me zoom in a bit so it's easier to read. So we're going to do Docker pull. So Docker pull, and then we're going to pull this, what we call image. So Docker has predefined files that outline the environment that is needed for a particular application, and these are called images. So the image that we want is the Microsoft MS SQL Server image. So we're going to do a Docker pull against that image. So you can hit pause, make sure you type it in just the way I have it. And when you press enter, it is going to go ahead, say, okay, I'm getting latest, and then you're going to see it downloading. So I already pulled that image, so I already have it on my machine, but you're going to see it say pulling, and then it's going to start showing you metrics of it downloading. And it would actually look something more like this. So this is a screenshot I took earlier from when I was downloading it, and you're going to see that it's going to spawn up a bunch of lines looking similar to this, and you're going to have these downloading tags. So once that is completed, the next step is to actually run it. So to run it, you need this command. So we're going to say Docker run, and then -e, and then we'll do the EULA accept. So what happens is that SQL Server usually has one of those documents that you need to accept the terms and conditions to. So we're just putting it in the parameter that yes, we accept the terms and conditions. And then another one that says SA password. So if you looked at the installation process when we're using Windows, we can use Windows authentication to connect to the database, right? So all we need is a machine name, and we can use the Windows user, the current Windows user, Windows authentication, and just connect. Now, because this is Docker and it's a container, there's no Windows or there's no Mac or there's no Linux authentication. So it's not really that you can just connect using the default user on your computer. So this step is applicable whether you're using Windows, Mac, Linux, etc. So what we need to do is specify an SA password. So SA is the default user, which means system admin or system administrator. Every time you install a database engine for Microsoft SQL Server, you get this SA user. So we're going to set up this SA password, and you can put in any password you wish, right? I'm just putting in a strong password here. And this is really a password that you might see in other demos that you might watch anywhere on the internet. So this password is not necessarily unique to me or to this exercise. You can put in any password value that you feel comfortable with and you know you will remember. So I'm just putting the word strong password, of course, with special characters, numerals, and a couple capital letters. Then we specify the port. So the port here at the front is the port that we want to go through, and the port on the other end of the colon is the port that it will map to. So what this means is SQL Server by default broadcasts from port 1433. That's the default port. So without doing anything, specifying any port or anything, we'll always go through 1433 once we're connecting. However, Docker is running in its own specialized environment. So we need to map. So this is the default port, and then this is the port from our machine that we want to tunnel through to get to this port. So you could actually just leave that as 1433, 1433. So if you don't have SQL Server installed already and you're running Mac and Linux, then 1433, 1433 is fine. You don't have to do anything extra. You can just connect. However, because I'm using a Windows machine, I had to change my port because 1433 is already occupied by my native SQL Server installation. So I'm just showing you that you can do 1433, 1433 by default, or you can put in your own specific port if you so desire. Then the next and final thing is we say -d, and then we specify the image that we want to run. So basically we're saying, Docker, run this image and make sure that all of these parameters in between are configured. That's essentially what we just did. So when you press enter and you allow this one to run, what it will do is launch that image inside of the Docker UI. So in the Docker UI, you're going to see something looking like this. It's going to appear under containers, and you can see here that I have several containers, right? I even have another SQL container that I'd installed from earlier, and here's the new one from my just running that command. So it created a brand new container for Microsoft SQL Server, and it is currently running, and it's been running for 30 seconds. And the port it uses is 1400, which if you didn't change that and you use the default 1433, would be 1433. You can always stop and start the containers. You can also delete, and you can also watch what is happening. So you can open it in the terminal, and you can interact with it here. You can also inspect to see the health of it and look at some of the configurations, right? So these are some of the environment variables that we had set up, or the parameters that we passed in. You can also look at the logs. So you see here that it seems to have started up successfully. So after I've confirmed all of these things, now I would want to connect. Now for Windows, we can use the Microsoft SQL Server Management Studio. However, Management Studio is not necessarily available on Linux and Mac. So the alternative here would be to get the Azure Data Studio. You can simply do a Google search and you can go ahead and follow the Microsoft documentation to the Azure Data Studio. So Azure Data Studio is a cross-platform database tool for professionals, and it can work on Windows, macOS, and Linux. So you can go ahead and install the appropriate version for yourself. And of course, you can look at any warnings just to make sure that you are in a compatible state. All right. So the thing is that the Data Studio can do most things that the Management Studio can do, especially within the confines of this course where we're learning about database development and queries and such. The experience, however, will be slightly different. So certain things won't be at the same place and might not be called the same thing. However, to connect, let me just show you how we connect to. So you can see I've connected to quite a few apps over the time, or databases rather. But here I'm going to connect Microsoft SQL Server, And then the server here is going to be localhost, comma, the port that you specified. So in my case, I specified 1400 on my port. You might have specified 1400 as well, or whatever it is that you specified when we said the container should run. And if you don't remember, you can just go back over and look. So you specify that port, and then not Windows authentication, but SQL login. And our username is SA, and our password is the password that we typed. And once again, if you don't remember what that password is, you can always go to the container and then click inspect. And I can just copy this value and then paste it. And then for future, you just remember password. Then we can connect. And then this is a sign of a successful connection. And you'll see here that OS version. So I am still on my Windows machine, but the OS version that it has detected is Ubuntu. So that is what the container is doing. It is running in a Linux environment, but it's simulating the environment, the exact environment needed for SQL Server to be able to run. Welcome back, guys. Now, in this lesson, we're going to be creating our ASP.NET Core MVC web application. Now, the first thing that you'll want to do is launch your terminal. Now, your terminal may look different based on the operating system you're on. So if you're on Linux, it will look different from if it's on Mac. Well, two of them will actually look pretty similar. But if you're on a Windows machine, then you'll want to look for either PowerShell or command prompt. I'm using a Windows 11 PC, so I actually have this window that's called Terminal, and it actually gives me access to the different kinds of terminals that I have on my machine. So you see here I have one tab called Windows PowerShell, another tab called Command Prompt. Even if your window doesn't necessarily look like this, you can do everything that we're about to do if you're using a Windows machine using the Command Prompt. Either way, the same commands that we will be running on my machine will work on any operating system. So I'm just going to close one of these tabs, and I'll just use the PowerShell window. And first of all, we want to make sure that we have .NET installed. So if you just say .NET and then --info, then you'll see a nice little printout like this showing all of the .NET runtimes you have installed. Now, I've been doing .NET development on this particular machine since 3.1 was the in thing. You see here that I have 5 and I also have 7. And if you look down here, you'll see that I also have access to versions of 6. All right. So that's evidence that .NET is successfully installed, and you want to make sure that you have 7 because we'll be using 7. However, if you installed and want to use 6, 90% of what we're about to do can work with 6. Where there's a difference, I will make sure to point it out. So now that we've validated that .NET is installed and we have access to the .NET CLI, what we need to do now is, and I'll just make this a little bigger so the commands are more visible. What we need to do now is navigate to a directory where we know we'll want to have our project, and then we'll create our new .NET application. So I'll just say CLS to clear the command prompt, and then make this a little bigger again. Now what we can do is navigate to the folder. So that looks something like CD, and then you choose your destination. So I have a special folder on my C drive that I use for projects. So I can navigate to that directory. And then I'm going to run a command that says .NET new MVC. And then I'm going to say -o. And this -o means where do I want to output this project? So I want it to create a new folder. If I don't do this, wherever I am, it will create a folder. So you could have created the folder yourself, whether using your user interface or your command line. And before I get into that, let me just show you how you would create that folder. So if I said mkdir, right, make directory, and then gave it a name, let's say test MVC app, then it would create that. Then I could say cd to test MVC app, and you see here that I have a number of folders. And then I could just say .NET new MVC. And then what that would do is create a brand new ASP.NET Core web app using the model view controller template. So that's what MVC means, just in case that wasn't made clear before. And they're letting you know it was created successfully. So they're letting you know that they have created the project in that path, and they gave the project the same name as the folder it was created in. All right, so that's a nice clean way to create a new MVC app. However, we're not going to be working on test MVC app. So I'm just going to do cd ... which brings me back up a directory. And let me clear my screen once more of any messages. I'll just go full screen this time around. And then let's do this end to end. So if I want a brand new .NET MVC application, so I'll say .NET new MVC, and then I'll say hyphen O, not zero, but O, and then give it the name of the directory. Now, in this course, we're going to be building a very small school management app, just enough to help a small school keep track of the students, the teachers, and the courses that they offer, right? So I'm just going to say school management app, right? And then I'll just say .mvc, just so we know that this is an MVC app for sure. And then when I press enter, what it's going to do is go ahead and create that new directory, school management app.mvc. And then in that new directory, create the project file to go with it. All right. So that's another way that we could do it. We could just say .NET new MVC hyphen O and then specify the project name. It will do both directory and project file in one sweep. Now, when we want to open this project, we have a nice keyboard shortcut that we can use, or another command shortcut rather. So if I now navigate to this folder and I say school management app MVC, so CD, jump over there, and then I can say code dot, look at what happens. And this is if you're using Visual Studio Code. So once you have Visual Studio Code, you have that environment variable in your command line. And then once you say code, full stop, it will open Visual Studio Code to the context of the folder that you have currently navigated to in the terminal. And sure enough, we are there with Visual Studio Code, and here are all of the files that have been created in that particular directory. Welcome back, guys. In this lesson, we're going to be touring Visual Studio Code for a little, right? It's a very versatile editor, and it's good to just know where things are and understand some of the prompts that we may see as we go along. So I have our school management app.mvc project open that we created before. And if you want to open a project, let's say Visual Studio Code closes and you want to get back there, you have the option of using the CLI and navigating there, or you could actually go to File and say Open Folder. And then from here, you can navigate to the folder and then select folder. And then you would have the same experience where Visual Studio Code will just load all the files that are currently in the folder in this section called the Explorer. You can dock this Explorer so you get more real estate for your code, or you can have it on the side. You can resize it at will, right? Sometimes you just don't want it that open, all right? You also have the ability to search through everything. So if I search for the letters MVC, then it's going to show me all of the places that appears, and I can do a search and replace quite easily, replacing all or replacing one at a time. Of course, I would suggest one at a time for bulk operations where you might have some clashes with what you're searching for, right? So you always want to be careful with that search and replace, especially for bulk operations. Then we have source control access. Now here, you might see an option that suggests that you install Git for your operating system. Now I'm on Windows, so if I didn't have Git installed already, it would say install Git for Windows, because what happens is that Visual Studio Code has a direct integration with Git, and it allows you to run all of your Git commands from right here quite comfortably without you ever having to get into the CLI, right? So knowing Git commands is cool, but with Visual Studio Code, you can kind of coast by without having an intimate knowledge of them. So you want to go ahead and get Git on your operating system. We will be using GitHub. So you see here that there's a nice big bright button that says publish to GitHub, because with a few clicks, we can actually push our project to GitHub, and we will be doing that later on. So we don't have to worry about that. Then there's run and debug. So run and debug actually allows us to execute our project, right? So with our Visual Studio experiment, you saw that we could click the button and it launched our project. Well, that's what run and debug does here. We'll look at how this works versus how we can do it in the CLI as well. Now I'm going to skip over Remote Explorer, and I'm skipping over that because you probably don't have that. This Remote Explorer is one of my additional plugins, and anything that you're seeing to the side on my computer that you're not seeing to the side on your computer means that these are additional extensions that I have installed for my own purposes. So I'm not going to prioritize anything that is not absolutely necessary for you to complete this course. So the next major icon that you'd want to pay attention to would be extensions. Now under extensions, you see that you have access to install different extensions and support for different project types based on your needs. So I work with Azure. I have quite a few Azure extensions installed, right? But then I also have snippets for like Bootstrap 5 to make my life easier. I also have a C# snippet. And you might have seen some prompts coming up about C# extension being needed based on the project type. So because we're going to be doing a C# project in .NET, this C# extension makes a lot of sense because it adds support for C# coding, syntax, and IntelliSense, and auto-completion, and a number of things. So I would suggest that you look for the C# extension. Now to install an extension, what you do is search the extensions marketplace up top here, and you can just simply write C#, and then that one will top the list because it's an official Microsoft extension, right? You can click it, and then where you see all of these buttons for me, you would actually see an install extension button. Like if I was to click one I don't have, there's what you would see, an install button. So you can go ahead and install it, and it might require that you restart your Visual Studio Code. So there are a number of handy extensions, and you always want to look at the publisher of the extension. And one thing that I use to gauge it as well is how many downloads it has, right? So the publisher is one, but then the number of downloads, in case you're not necessarily familiar with the publisher, the number of downloads is also a very good indicator as to its stability and how well used it is. Now, another thing that you may notice, and I think I mentioned before, is that Visual Studio Code might show you little pop-ups suggesting that you get particular extensions or you install certain extensions based on your project type. You can actually go ahead with those, right? Visual Studio Code is just making suggestions to help you to have the best experience that you can based on what you're working on. So I have installed a number of extensions. You can see here that I have 45 extensions. So it just goes to show Visual Studio Code's versatility, because I've used it for ARM template development. I've used it for Angular development. I've used it for Azure development. I've used it for some data workbook stuff that's still Azure, right? Laravel, PHP, right? Python. These are all things that I have used it to do. And these are things that you can use it for in the future as you develop and you want to explore different avenues. So Visual Studio Code is almost like an all-in-one IDE for various platforms. So if this is your first time using Visual Studio Code, I do encourage you to go ahead and explore and see how it supports other languages and other frameworks and how you can use it to your advantage. Now, another thing that I want to Let's move on from extensions. Another thing that I want to point out before we get into any real development would be the fact that it has a built-in terminal. So before now, all of what we did to create the project and so on, we did in the native terminal of our operating system. However, while we're in Visual Studio Code, we probably don't want to be jumping in and out and between windows. So it conveniently has included a terminal for us. So you can get there by using the keyboard shortcut that is here, or you can just click it, of course, and that will launch a terminal window. And this terminal window is based on PowerShell, but guess what? We have options. So we can actually have multiple terminals running simultaneously. So I could actually add another terminal window. And if I wanted one that was just command prompt, right? If I wanted one that was a git bash, and you'll get git bash once you install git on your machine. And I mentioned it before, but I didn't show you. So you can get git. You can get git by going to git-scm.com. Or you can just Google git, and I'm sure the first search result would give you this website. Now, you can download it for various operating systems, as it is cross-platform as well. So you can get the Windows, the Mac, and you can get it for your Linux distros. And it's natively a command line interface, right? But then you do have certain tools that can give you a user interface. And like Visual Studio Code, once again, is such a tool that will allow you to do Git related commands here, right? So those are things that we can do. Now, if I wanted to run our application here using .NET CLI, I can, in the terminal, and let me just close the terminal windows that I'm not using, right? So you see that little rubbish bin. You can just click that to kill the window. And I'm going to jump over to the properties folder and launch settings file, right? So I'm going to give you a tour of the file so you can understand everything that's happening. But before that, I just want to focus on this launch settings file. Now, we have two profiles. We have HTTP and we have HTTPS. If we wanted to run our application, it would default to HTTP. So if I say .NET run, it would actually default to the HTTP profile and launch our HTTP version of our application, quote unquote version. It's the same version, same code, just probably different behavior security wise. But then if we wanted to run using the HTTPS setting, then we would have to specify in our .NET run. So I'm just going to make this terminal window a bit bigger, and you can do that by holding down Control and pressing plus to increase the overall size of your Visual Studio Code user interface, and Control minus to reduce it, right? So you can play around with that and get it adjusted to an appropriate size for your screen. And then what I'll say is .NET run, and then I can say launch profile, and then specify that I want to use the HTTPS launch profile. Now, when I press enter, it's going to build, and then we'll see the terminal output that our application is now listening on our HTTPS port and the HTTP, right? So if I didn't do this part of it, it would still run, but it would just be listening on the HTTP port of 5246. All right. So those are just some nuggets. So if we control click this URL, it will launch our browser, and then we can see here that this is our MVC application running from inside of Visual Studio Code. All right. And when I'm finished doing what I'm doing, I can just use Control C to shut down. So when I'm finished testing and I want to get back into code and I want to stop the server that's running, I can just Control C, and then it will shut it down and return me to the CLI interface. All right. So that's a nice, quick and dirty tour of Visual Studio Code and what it can do for you. There are other little nuggets that we will discover along the way. I don't want to give you information overload. I just wanted to point out some of the most essential things for our development tasks. And as we go along, we will see more. Now, one nice feature, it's not absolutely necessary, but it's one that I use, and it will probably influence the experience that you have based on how I do my thing. But I use autosave. So if you go to File, you go to if you scroll down a little, you'll see autosave. So you'll see that it's ticked for me. So that means as I type, Visual Studio Code is automatically saving my changes. And if you enable it, you will have that similar experience. Otherwise, of course, after you make changes to a file, you need to either save it or do a build every time to see the reflection in the testing environment. So autosave can save a lot of time when it comes to that. We also can go and change our settings. So if you want to use a different color theme, there it is. You can change your theme to whether light, or I like dark. So, I'm not going to change from dark, but you can choose the one that you like. You can also enable things like word wrap and change even your font size from the settings, right? So you can change the font type that you're using. You can change the font size. So mine is 30 right now. If you want word wrap, you can search for it here and you can change it, whether you want it on or off. I have it on. Now, when we come back, we'll take a tour of our project files.